Hi, everyone. This is Olga Mack, still working from home, building the future of contracts. And today I am with May. May, please introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Meyling Ly Ortiz. I go by May, and I'm managing counsel at Toyota.
You and I have so much in common. It's kind of remarkable. When I talk to you, I feel a kindred spirit. And I think a lot of commonalities come from the fact that we have shared immigration experiences. And I feel that those immigration experiences very much shaped my life, my career, my outlook on life. So I would love to talk to you about it. So tell us a little bit more about your background.
Yeah, sure. So my parents are from Cambodia. They're refugees. They escaped during the time of the Khmer Rouge. For those who are unfamiliar, there was a dictator, Pol Pot, and he tried to establish an agrarian society. And so basically that meant anyone that was educated, they wore glasses, they were executed. So essentially it was a genocide that my parents escaped. My parents came to America in 1980, and a month later, I was born. That's a little bit about where my parents came from and a little bit of my story.
You were born in the United States, and clearly, this is your homeland. But also the members of your household, had experiences elsewhere. What experiences as a child did you have that you think that might have been a little different from experiences of kids in your school?
I think first and foremost is realizing that you're different. And I know that may catch people off guard, but not being familiar with why, there's a Christmas tree and presents at Christmas, right? I mean, just culturally there's a disconnect in what you hear and learn about at school and what the other kids talk about and what's happening in your own household. And so just realizing early on that you are a little bit different. And then secondly, when your parents aren't native, you end up speaking on their behalf a lot of times, which I kind of credit to probably why I chose law. I mean, I remember early on, being 8 years old and my parents handing me a contract and saying, read this to us, tell me what this means, right? And only because I knew the language better, but not necessarily what the words meant, but just being able to read, as opposed to my parents' experience.
What do you remember the distinct times? I know you even mentioned the Christmas tree time, the times when you felt maybe a little different, and has that feeling sort of persisted throughout life, or has it sort of disappeared over time?
Yeah, I laugh a little bit because I think as a child, rightly or wrongly, you just want to fit in, right? And the fact that I would bring different ethnic food from home for lunch made that very difficult. And I just giggle because there are so many times where people are like, oh, what are you eating? What is that? And so I think early on, you definitely feel different. Quite frankly, gosh, I mean, that's such a great question because I think you're right. I don't know that I ever shook that feeling off that I'm different. And while for some that might seem like a negative, I've really seen how it's been instrumental in my life and my career. Yes, I'm different, but perhaps because of that, I work so hard to connect with other people, right? So that I wouldn't seem so different. And so I think looking back, it was really helpful.
Yeah, I'm with you. The food is definitely sort of the easy to see sign, right?
Yeah.
The holidays, the food. I remember my first experience. I immigrated right at the end of middle school, beginning of high school, and there was a picture of my first day in this public school in San Francisco, and everybody is just like having this baggy clothes, and I'm like really. Perfectly dressed and clearly out of place because, where I came from, that's how you look in school. And clearly the kids around me felt this and I felt this, but it was a snap and picture of the first date, right? And you feel it then and you feel it now. And well, the big difference is the spin you put on it, right? Because as a child, I certainly was not secure enough to to say what you just said. Well, let me take my differences and make them superpower.
Right. Oh my gosh. And what you're saying resonates so much because I mean, there are a number of photos from school that you knew that my parents dressed me because there's no concept of matching. Like matching colors and patterns wasn't a thing. Were you fully clothed? Were they clean? You're going to school, you know?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And food is another thing, right? And food comes both in what it is and how it smells and what it looks. And sometimes, depending who you deal with, unfamiliar is exciting and exotic. And sometimes it's foreign and other, right? And so you never know who you deal with and what reaction that will elicit. And are you going to be the exotic outsider or a very threatening foreigner? Very interesting when you talk about speaking on behalf of and being your parents, both sort of the language interpreter, but then there's sort of a cultural interpreter and all kinds of other interpreter. And I think for most of us who immigrated in the United States, there is this contract or letter that you interpret. And there's an expectation that you are fluent in it. And that's a lot of pressure.
Yes, it is. And, and when you have a community, I'm not sure if you grew up with a community of immigrants, but we did, you're not only expected that pressure for your family, but for neighbors who don't know the language. I mean, suddenly, neighbors are knocking your door, be like, hey, we understand that you can read. Tell us what this means, And so growing up, having that experience of naturally speaking on behalf, helping interpret early on. Yeah. Which is probably why I know a lot of times people get asked the question of like, what would their superpower be? And I think mine would be to be able to speak every kind of language, right? Because I've seen the power of connecting and communication and how you're less of an other, usually, when you can speak the language, right? I've certainly seen that when I visit other countries, right? When you even at least try in broken, whatever language it is over there, it just cuts through some of that disconnect or that distance.
Yeah, no, language is definitely a quick way to separate people by in and out, right? Whether it's just speaking or speaking well, or speaking with poise, right? That sort of persists in every level of society. As an immigrant, you sort of aware of your accent, but then as you, for example, progress in your career, there's sort of this concept of executive presence, and that means speaking certain way and looking certain way. And so that separation by perception, it's not just for immigrants, it's really just kind of throughout our lives. But as an immigrant, you feel it in a very powerful way. You started talking about superpower and how kind of maybe turning your insecurities into superpowers. Tell me about your journey with that, with languages and choosing to become a lawyer, and how to turning kind of maybe differences into advantages.
Yeah, I think back to kind of a distinct time where, we go back to, I think, high school, and I distinctly, and just a little bit of background, I grew up in a small country town. We were the only Asian family in the whole town. So talk about another feeling of other, right? Because you're other, because you're the only. So in that, so when you go to lunch and you decide which lunch table to sit, I didn't have a place to sit. I didn't have a regular table. There were the African-American kids. They were the, Latinx kids. There were the jocks and the cheerleaders. There were the people who were in band. And I didn't fit in anywhere. But my experience growing up is that I could fit anywhere, even though I didn't have a place. So even though I grew up feeling very different, it caused me to be able to communicate and connect with people regardless of who they are and, what clique they're in. And I think that's, looking back, what's made me, effective as a lawyer today, quite frankly, being able to connect to people regardless of their backgrounds. So I guess that's an example of an insecurity, or perhaps growing up. Let's be honest. I hated high school. Okay. I hated it. It was terrible. I felt so alone.
Who didn't? Who didn't?
Yeah. I mean, I hated it. But looking back, I think there was, it turned out fine.
Yeah, I've certainly had similar experiences. And I once talked to a general counsel who explained to me that, people who don't have, so to speak, a table to sit at because they don't fit a designation, they have to very early on figure out, let's just call them purple people, how to fit into blue people world. And, those colors could be really, your ethnicity, your origin, your gender, your anything. And from early on, those purple people learn, they have a very high EQ because they have to figure out how to fit into the blue world or the green world because they don't belong on any table. And so they kind of have superpowers because of that. That explanation was given to me by one of the sort of well-known general counsel, and I find it very enlightening and very much correspond to what you just said.
Yeah, I love it. That resonates so much. And I even think back about, I think that's why I'm comfortable being the only, growing up and being in law school or being a lawyer, whether it's the only woman or the only Asian American, or I'm comfortable with that. I'm fine with that. And I think it's because I was that for so long.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I'm usually the only Olga in the room. In the United States. Now, up until 13, I was one of, I think, 15 Olgas in my school, in my class, not my school. So I was an average Jane until 13. And then I became not so average. And remembering those two realities is very powerful as you kind of go through life. If you weren't a lawyer, what would you be?
Gosh, I mean, so many interests. I think I would be a writer. And I know it's like, well, what kind of writer? I don't know. I just enjoy writing. So I don't know if it would be in academia where I could like research and learn and get paid to just learn and teach, or be a novelist. But I would love to write.
So the other thing we have in common is the shared refugee experience, obviously from different places. And that's very powerful because in my experience, those reasons for being refugee, which is not, it's different reason to leave the country. It's not necessarily to look for a prosperity. It's for fear of your life. So
right.
It's a very different reason to move.
Very different.
That stays within your family for a long time, for generations after generations.
Yes.
Tell me how that shaped you.
Yeah, gosh. I mean, looking back, there was certainly this sense of you cannot fail because we've escaped something so terrible that I don't know. It was just expected that you are going to come to America, get an education to succeed. Like that, we escaped with our lives so that you could have one. And so I think early on, having that responsibility placed on you, even as a child, right? I don't know, rightly or wrongly. I mean, when you talk about the refugee experience, there's a lot of trauma, right? A lot of trauma in generations. And then I think part of that, again, rightly or wrongly, showed up in guilt, right? If I didn't do well, it was like, you got an opportunity that other people didn't get, right? So don't, I guess, mess up. I mean, I couldn't mess up, and I don't know if that's necessarily healthy or not, but that certainly was my upbringing.
Yeah, no, there is this thing as a little bit of sense in invincibility, right? If I could escape this horror, what could possibly go wrong? It's a little bit of starting life with, I already got away, right? So it can only get better from here. So there's definitely this sense, but I'm with you because this stories of other lives, traumatic lives, especially, when my parents sound like exactly like your parents, where, there's like, Olga, you're given a gift.
Right. Right.
Do not lose it. It's sort of a consistent narrative and persistent narrative. And it's funny, my parents helped me raise my children, and my children get it too. What I find it interesting how you made a choice of going to law school. What was there a particular reason or event that inspired you to end up in law school?
Yeah, I wish I did have kind of an inspirational story. I mean, I guess, to be honest, the first thing is that, at least a common narrative with Asian American immigrants, and I don't know if your experience was any different, but I was really given two choices. It was doctor or lawyer. Sometimes we also get engineer in there, but my parents didn't know what that was. So it was like, May, you're going to go to school and you're going to be a doctor or a lawyer. And I'm not really fond of blood. I'm quite squeamish. So there we go. I kind of landed in being a lawyer, but I'm so glad that I ended up loving it. Right. I know lots of colleagues who, don't love it and maybe you're still in it, but I love it. And maybe it's because of, our past experience of just speaking on behalf of people, advocating, helping interpret, helping our neighbors and aunts and uncles solve problems. I think it just came really natural. So I'm glad that I ended up here. But but there was no glamorous story. It was an edict. It was an edict.
I don't know. It's actually kind of, I guess, good enough story. In my case, it started as a joke. I didn't speak English, and people would ask me this idiotic question: "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And I am one of those people who likes telling things that elicit reaction. So I would say I would like to be a lawyer, and I don't speak English. And it's really interesting to see people scorn them. They don't want to tell you that you speak English and you don't stand a chance. Because they're too polite Americans, right? But on the other hand, it's sort of you can see it right in their faces that you're giving them some nonsense that they can't find a quiet place in their head. And watching them struggle is sort of entertaining. So, and I've done it so many times that I, over time, convinced myself that that's where I'm going. So kind of like you. But did you find that, kind of having the background of, immigration and being a refugee, kind of having more of a worldview as you got to law school, as you got to practice in the corporate world, do you think that really that experience kind of set you apart, gave you advantage, or in any way sort of shaped your thinking?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. As far as worldview, I think it does shape your experience or your perception of things. And I think, again, it's just that, knowing that there's always a different culture, or there could be a different interpretation, or it could be received differently. Maybe a nod back to your note about higher EQ. I think, looking at my experience as a lawyer, whether it was a trial lawyer or whether in-house, I can't really turn it off. I'm able to read the unsaid words or feelings in a room and obviously, help solve the client's problems, maybe problems that they're not even saying. So I definitely think that's a key component. A second thing is probably, grit, resilience, right? There's a part of it when you're immigrant, you don't know a lot of things. You don't know what you don't know, but there's a confidence in knowing that you can figure it out because you're not afraid to ask people questions. Or at least, that's my experience. That maybe I don't know the etiquette or I don't know the rules, but I've gotten really good at observing, maybe emulating, copying at first until I can figure out my own style. And then just being really resourceful, right? So I think those are key things that have made my experience different.
Yeah, no, that completely resonates, along with scrappiness.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, that's the word I was looking for.
Yeah, scrappiness is, the grit, the resilience, the scrappiness. It's one of those things where, having gone through immigration, having gone through, going from one place to another for choices other than just sort of pursuit of happiness, but for fear, you really kind of get connected with that feeling of great perseverance and scrappiness. And it becomes such part of your DNA and everything you do. And it stays on.
It does. Because I remember a time when we didn't have a car and, we rode the bus, and I grew up in California before moving to Texas. So I remember taking, the bus, and I remember there were times when we didn't really eat a lot of meat because it was more expensive. And so by choice or happenstance, we had to be more of a vegetarian lifestyle. I mean, I just remember things like when you're not a person who's used to having a lot and you realize you can get by with just a little, there's that scrappiness that you're talking about and that grit and resilience of this is where we are now, but we'll figure it out and it'll get better.
Yeah, I remember the bus rides all the way until I got married. I didn't have a license when I got married, actually, in the United States, because I basically was driving a bus all the way through law school and beyond. That was some of the reasons, I suppose. I was definitely not because I was afraid of driving or anything like that. And I remember my soon-to-be husband was very surprised that I was not a typical American who got her license at the age of 14 or 15. He was sort of puzzled why I didn't take advantage of that freedom. And I was explaining to him that the concept of freedom means much more than a driver's license.
Oh my gosh, 100%.
It does lead to kind of interesting conversations and choices in life. There's a lot of conversations around sort of branding. I often wonder whether this kind of refugee immigration experiences could be part of, I guess, to me, branding means your reputation, part of kind of reputation and your DNA and who you are and how you authentically show up. I guess I do want to talk to you a little bit about what is kind of, I guess, let's just call it branding or reputation means to you. And, and how do you build it? How do you show up as yourself?
I think first and foremost, I love that we're going to agree to a definition, because I think branding means different things to different people. And like you, I think it's a reputation. And I think it has to be authentic, right? And I think it has to really reflect your core values and who you are. As far as how the immigrant experience kind of falls into that, I think it's something that I really can't separate from who I am. Therefore, it's a part of it, right? Like if I introduce myself, a lot of times I do say, I'm the child of refugees. And I think it's important for people to know that, because with that comes a lot of what I'm proud of, that I am scrappy, that I'm resourceful, I figure things out, that I'm a hard worker, right? All those is really enveloped in just identifying myself or my brand as I'm a child of immigrants or I'm a child of refugees. I think that's very powerful, maybe in a storytelling way, right? One sentence to say that, to encapsulate all these character aspects that I want people to know about me.
Yeah, there's no neutral way to say that one, you're an immigrant, two, you're a refugee, right? There's a baggage that comes with it.
Yes, there is. And I don't know. And then I think about part of it is, I distinctly remember he was my first employer. His mom was from Estonia, but he was born here. And as a young lawyer working for him, he was like, I can tell that you're a child of immigrants. And I was like, well, what do you mean by that? He was like, well, you work really hard, but also you turn off all the lights in the office. You go around turning off all the lights when no one's in the room. And I was like, well, yeah, you can't waste electricity. And it was funny because he saw that in me. He read that from me from just a small thing, I don't know why he didn't go with environmentalist. He just said, yeah, you're just like my mom. I bet you are really thrifty and don't waste things. But I was like, well, I don't know, but you definitely have to turn off the lights.
That may be much deeper than we want to discuss with you, but yes, the lights turn you off. Yeah. I love that. You're also very passionate about sort of mentoring and helping other people out. Where does this come from? But where does this passion come from? Is that part of that DNA, immigrant DNA, or is it from somewhere else?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is really much ingrained in my immigrant experience. Because quite frankly, when you come here as an immigrant, I mean, unless you're sponsored by family or someone that has, like money, when you're a refugee, you come with nothing, right? And so you necessarily have to rely on, for us, it was American Red Cross, or rely on a nonprofit. Sometimes it's churches that help sponsor and help refugees. So I think ingrained early on is that you cannot do it alone. People help you. And in turn, you need to be able to help others, right? It's that kind of reciprocity that's ingrained in you early. So I think that's where it comes from.
Yeah, immigration is definitely a community experience.
Yes. So good. Yeah.
Whether you are sponsored or not, whether you feel part of the community or outside of the community, you always have a relationship with the community, whether it's positive or negative, whether it's helpful or not. And it's actually often not just one way or another, it's just sort of a shifting definition, point in time question, right? Sometimes you fit in and sometimes you don't fit in. Sometimes you're helped and sometimes you're not. Sometimes you are being helpful. And that help is either not welcome or very welcome, right? So you always have this relationship with the community of which you're part of or hope to be part of or hope not to be part of. Yes. It's sort of ongoing conversation. Yeah, no, I kind of like yourself. I very intrinsically kind of think of the world as collection of community with whom I have various degrees of relationships and fluidity of coming in and out and keeping in touch. In law, what do you think that concept of community and identity that ties with it? How do you think it's helpful or not helpful to the profession? And I guess
oh my gosh, yeah.
And does it help great lawyers to be greater? Or what are your views about legal community?
I think you're right. It is a very distinct community. And it's a shame that the community often gets painted with a negative brush. I mean, I just grew up, even though I, decided ultimately to be a lawyer, but there are so many lawyer jokes, right? And there's so many movies about, unscrupulous lawyers and things like that. And in my 15 years of practice, I couldn't find anything further than the truth. I mean, lawyers are often leaders in our community. They're often leaders in, our government, in, maybe I shouldn't go there with that example right now, but they're leaders in our companies. They are often civic leaders, community leaders. They're the ones who often contribute and plan and raise money for nonprofits. Gosh, when I think about lawyers, at the core, we help people, right? We help people solve problems. And that, I think, is a really special thing about our profession. I do think, though, that if you aren't involved, right, in the community, you can really do yourself a disservice. And maybe it's just because I have always been a person really involved, and I've seen how lawyers have helped me and how we can help each other, and just really help the community or help each other build our business or whatever that is. I've just seen so much strength in leaning into the community versus kind of being on your own.
Yeah, I've had very positive experiences with communities in law. I've been helped by many communities. I've been embraced by many communities. I've built many communities. I've contributed to many communities. Throughout my practice, both legal practice and in my adventures in the future of law, the community has always been there for me.
Yes.
And whether I am as a contributor or I am as a beneficiary or building the greater future for everybody else, it really, the community has propelled me forward. It's not any one community. It's not any one person. It's the collective experience of being with like-minded professionals who may be quite different. They may have very different life stories. But I find that law is such a great thing that I have in common with the members of the community, and this community kind of can be large or small, and it's ever changing. That if you kind of a really good member, respectful member, contributing member, you really can grow with community and propel the community forward and yourself forward. So I often find grateful for the community, legal community that kind of keeps changing, but has always been there for me.
Yeah, 100%. And just the depth of that thought leadership, right? Like you said, we may be lawyers, but just the diverse thinkers and just someone to bounce ideas off of. I think it's so rich.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I find your observation is that, you definitely see, a lot of lawyers being leaders.
Yes.
And, and I often joke, it's really funny that in a society where, most parents, really would like their kids to be lawyers. What's amazing is that most people make fun of lawyers.
Yes. I've not thought about that disconnect before, but it's so true.
Yeah, and maybe it's sort of our dysfunctional relationship with law, that maybe the law does not always serve us, or we don't always understand it, and maybe it's projected to lawyers as well. But I find that disconnect a little interesting. I've never been able to quite explain it. But yes, for a country where almost every parent wants their child to be a lawyer, or at least would not mind them being one, it is disturbingly high number of people who actually, tell, lawyer jokes and have really interesting relationships with law. We're coming to the end of this conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it,
Me too.
and really learned so much from you. And I find it really amazing, how having immigration experience and having a refugee experience, even from very different parts of the world for very different reasons, gives us so much in common. It's when you say something, I feel like listening to myself.
Same.
So it's amazing. It's almost talking to my own reflection to some extent. Do you have any kind of as mantras or things that help you go forward as you move through life? Maybe things that have persistent, since you were a child and you felt different, maybe through law school, maybe through your career, that you find particularly helpful?
Yeah, I think for a couple of years, it was presence over perfection, because I think as lawyers, we chase perfection. And that rightly or wrongly can lead to, a lot of anxieties and depression in our profession. So for a while, it was always presence over perfection. And then just this last year, 2020, right, changes lots of things. I think I changed it to presence over progress, right? Because in the pandemic, I don't know, I feel like a lot of us may have felt stuck. But in the end, at least, I definitely don't want to diminish other people's experience with the pandemic. But for me, all in all, it was a good time to really be more present with my children and be more introspective about, what I think is most important in my life. So that's one. And then the second one that I've had for a couple of years is grit, gratitude, and grace. Grit, again, kind of comes from our immigrant experience. We'll get through it. Hard work, preparation, we'll figure it out. And then gratitude, when you come to a country with nothing, I think you're very grateful for what you have. And then last, grace. I think giving ourselves permission to make mistakes and to grow is huge.
Thank you so much for finding the time to have this conversation around immigration.
Thank you so much. It's been so fun.